Myra Gleeson spends her days arranging the displays in a city centre store, and her nights researching the exploits of Ireland's early women aviators.
I never knew that there were any women in Ireland who were interested in aviation. In school, I only learned political or just political history or religious history, and there was no mention of any women in Ireland who did anything like this.
What sparked her interest and her crusade was seeing by chance a photograph of this woman, Lilian Bland, in the Aviation Museum.
Lillian Bland was the very first lady in the world to build and fly her own aircraft. Now, to get that into perspective, if you would consider today a chimpanzee flying a Boeing 747 full of passengers, as horrendous as that thought is to us, equally in 1910, the thought of a lady building and flying her own aircraft was out of this world, out of the question. She was considered an oddity, she was considered very much an eccentric. But of course she wasn't. She was a very brave lady who got hit by the aviation bug. And as we all know, once you catch it, there's no cure. And she got it, and she pioneered flight in this country.
So, an important woman, but for Myra Gleeson, a brief biography wasn't enough. She wanted to fill in the details, to get photographs, to find out what sort of person Lillian Bland had been. Reference books were an obvious first step, then aviation magazines and newspaper files. She knew Lillian Bland had ended her days in Britain, so that's where she turned next.
I got the telephone book and I got all the surname Blands in England, and I wrote to them personally, and out of that I got two responses. Well, I got a lot of responses, but two which led me to where she finished up living, which was in Sennan in Cornwall. And Lillian's best friend had a lot of stuff on Lillian, and she gave me the last photograph that was ever taken of her just before she died in 71 at the age of 92.
Although Lillian Bland had died in Britain, she'd been brought up in Ireland, in Carnmoney near Belfast. Then her home was surrounded by fields. Now it's in suburbia and owned by a property developer. By 1910, when she made her first flight, she was 32 and already known in the area as someone who wouldn't bend to the conventions of the day. She wore breeches and rode a horse like a man, for example, refusing to ride side saddle. And that wasn't all.
She was so independent that she even smoked cigarettes, and by the time she was 30 she wasn't married, and most men couldn't handle her because she was so independent and such a strong-headed person. Lillian was a great old sport, and she liked to put a bet on the horses, and when she returned to England in 1935 she lived with her brother for a short time, and nearly every day she put a bet down on the old horses, and she made quite a big win in 1955, enough for her to buy a house down in Cornwall and retire permanently. So she had a lot of spirit.
Myra Gleeson now has enough detail to put together a book on the life of Lillian Bland. But like many research projects, as it's gone on, it's expanded. So a book on early Irish female aviators is her latest aim. Women like Mary Dillon, Lady Heath, Lady Bailey, and this woman, now living in St Agnes's Sisters of Charity Convent in Crumlin in Dublin. Sister Catherine Butler's been a nun for over 50 years, but as a young woman she was a pilot. Indeed, she was only the third woman in Ireland to get a pilot's licence. She says she was attracted by the risk.
Oh, it was a great risk in those days. You know, we had nothing, no connection with the earth at all. There was no whatever you call the thing, the speaking thing.
Radar or radio?
No, nothing, absolutely nothing. You were completely on your own, and it was an open cockpit, so you always had to have a helmet and a leather coat and goggles and all that. You were frightfully cold, even in the summer the wind would nearly skin you. And in the winter then, of course, it was horrific, but we loved it.
And after 50 years away from aircraft, she was in the air again recently, as a passenger. And her verdict? Modern small planes aren't nearly so much fun.
You had to do more yourself. You weren't depending on instruments and depending on men in a control tower telling you things. I'd like to do my own. You see, we were very free. When you went out for a lesson, you could take off whenever you liked. Now that day when I was out at Iona, we had to wait until Dublin Airport told us to go. And I didn't like that kind of thing.
So you're a nun who doesn't like discipline then, is that right?
Oh, I don't mind discipline, but I don't like being ordered about by men. Oh, we have to submit to discipline, all right. But there's a difference, you know. My vow wouldn't extend, you know, to flying.
And Myra Gleeson intends to put Sister Catherine and her exploits into her planned book. A book she hopes will give women their proper place in the history of Irish aviation.
I don't think it's really anybody's fault because it's just one of those things, and but I'd like to see it changed, and I'd like to see that particularly children in schools would learn a little bit more about these women.
When we flew, it was, you were sticking out of an open cockpit and you had no help, you just had to depend on your own initiative and the grace of God to get you up and down.
They got away from the kitchen sinks and they got away from the knitting and they went out. They competed with the men. They didn't follow, they led. And they have contributed an awful lot to not only Irish aviation history, but world aviation history.